Right. So first things first, we had something left from last time, I think, which was about DOM manipulation. Yes. So we're going to talk about DOM manipulation first, but the main subject we're going to talk about is CSS. And the main part of the main subject is CSS selectors. Right. So first things first, like I said, talking about DOM manipulation, I'm going to do, if you think about how a single page app is going to work, it's first going to do some network communication, but based on the responses from the network, it's going to modify the structure of the page. Right? So you're going to see in a React app that what's going to happen is, if you think about it the simplest shape possible, you have a container which is the root container, and under that container, on the one hand there's HTML, but probably you have an abstraction which is a component tree. And when the component tree is drawn, is rendered, what you get is some HTML. So you render the component tree based on what you receive from the server, and you reattach it in the root. Now, obviously, one second. So obviously, reattaching the whole thing, redrawing the whole thing every time is not going to be that efficient. So it's not done like that. Part of the tree is re-rendered, but in principle, this is what's happening. Right. So let's see how you manipulate the DOM. We're not going to do this by hand as a main concern. However, it's interesting to see how everything works. Now in this case, notice that I have a bunch of tags here. So I get them via the classic method. That is, they have IDs, and I get them with document getElement by ID. Now, the way I'm getting them is not really all that flexible, right? It assumes that I've modified the structure especially for that. GetElement by ID does not only exist on document, but also on any HTML element. And I can use a bunch of other methods, such as getElements by tag name, getElements by class name. One sec. Right, but those are not really all that granular. So I'm going to need, and this is going to lead us to the next subject, I'm going to need some sort of query language which allows me to select any possible subset of the nodes of a tree. This is what CSS selectors are going to plug in, and query selector, what you were saying. So we're going to see that in the next example, but for now, so we get them with getElement by ID. So there's two ways of manipulating the DOM. One of them is that any HTML element has a property called inner HTML. Right? And if I put a string in inner HTML, it is automatically parsed. It's a matter of taste and of granular control, of how clear I have what's happening. In this case, what I'm doing is I'm creating a div element. Now it's created in memory, so it doesn't exist in the document. And it gets to be in the document when I append it to something. Right? Now I have a bunch of these methods which allow me to append something, to remove something from the DOM. Now this is granular control in the sense that instead of redrawing everything that was inside, I can control what I take out, but it's going to be faster, right? And maybe easier to understand, but this is going to depend on the code I read. So let me just find this again because I closed it, and let me show you what this does. This is really a really simple thing, so it doesn't do much, but it just modifies the DOM. And if I inspect these, I'm going to see that what's happening is that divs are going to be dynamically added. Right. Now, to see a bit of a more complex example, so what happens if I want to, so I added things, let's see, say I want to remove things. Right, if I want to remove things, I'm going to have to refine them somehow. Right? I have to know what thing I'm trying to remove. Whenever I have a list of items, I'm going to have some sort of unique ID to the items. This is not as much as a problem as it seems. It's a problem in really niche situations, because generally what I'm going to see in my application are items which come from a storage system of sorts, right, a database. And within that, that storage system, they have probably been stored with a unique ID. Right? So if I have a list of cats, each cat has an ID, because the storage system wouldn't have worked without an ID. Which means I can use those IDs. But they do have to have something unique. In this case, we don't have that. So we have a really naive solution, in the sense that we've elected to identify our divs via a custom attribute. Now I can define any attribute I might want. However, as a matter of coding style, they should be prefixed with data or data X. That is because, whilst when I write the code the first time, my attributes might not come into conflict with some attributes from HTML. HTML itself might evolve, right? And then, at some point in the future, my code would become unrunnable because there's already those attributes which have been added in the meantime, right? It's a dynamic system, right? So, so in this case, the naive bit is that I've used the text content as a key. This is not a great idea. Probably I'd have to have a unique identifier. If I ever have to actually do this strictly on the client side, I'm going to use something which generates unique identifiers. However, I'm mostly not. I did run into a situation where I needed that, but this is somewhat rare. Now, when I want to remove one of the elements, because I just have two buttons in the text input, but when I want to remove one of the elements, I have to find it. Right? And to find it, I used this expression, which is we're going to see come into later. But if you think about differentiating between these items, what I want to ask is which is the item for which data key has a particular value. Right? And this is what this expression means. This is an attribute selector, and again, we're going to come back to it. But, like you said, given that I have this sort of language to search for nodes in a tree, I can use it within two methods. One of them which is called query selector, and one of them which is called query selector all. A query selector is going to give me the first element matching a particular selector or null. Null if it doesn't find it. Whilst the query selector all is going to give me all elements that match a particular selection or an empty array, an empty list. It doesn't actually give me an array. What it gives me is something which is called the node list, which can be converted relatively easily to array. But the result of query selector all doesn't have a map, for example, because it's not an array. Right, so let's see this in action and then move to CSS. Now the issue with this implementation is that if I give the same key twice, it doesn't work. Right, but this works. So they can be added or removed. Again, we're not going to be doing this by hand unless we have time to look over stuff like web components, but I don't think we will. Okay, so that's the DOM manipulation bit. If you have any questions up until this point, then CSS onwards. Right, so CSS is a couple of things, which are, well, they work together to let the browser draw what I have on the screen. But there's a bit in CSS which isn't about drawing, right? So it's I have a language which allows me, like I said, to select a subset of the nodes of a tree, and this is called CSS selectors. And then, why am I selecting those nodes? Well, I might be doing it for JavaScript, so I couldn't tell you. It's depending on the logic of the code. But if I do it from CSS rules themselves, what's going to happen is I'm selecting the nodes so I can specify what properties they have in regards to drawing. Right. So let's look over CSS selectors and look over how rules compose. Right. So I think no, it's not this one. It's this one. It's not this one. I'm looking at the wrong thing. 1 second. Right. So first things first. How do I add these styles? What are these styles? And how do I add them to my page, right? My document? So I can add them in 3 ways, and you can also see here how one of these CSS rules looks like. Right. So it looks like search expression. Right? So this selects all the nodes that fit that particular selector, which we're going to talk about in a sec. And for all those nodes, it's going to set the background color property to red or whatever it is. It's pure red, right? It's red. The second way of doing this, because it's a bit tedious to have everything in style blocks, is to have them in external files. And in this case, I have this file.css, and it says it has a similar rule. And the third way is to just put to use a global attribute which is called style. And when I put something in style, it's going to have a special effect. So let's think about something else. So what if I have two of these selectors, and they select the same element, and they have different rules for the same element, right? So I have to have some sort of precedence between them. I have to know which one of the rules is going to apply. Yeah, which is called, this is based on a couple of rules. One of which is not generally intuitive, and it's called specificity. We're going to talk about that. Right, so first of all, so the general, if you were to just list a bunch of general rules, you're going to say whatever is more specific is going to apply over whatever is more generic. Now, this sort of rule has existed since civilization exists. Right? I can tell you from my law studies a Latin phrase which actually says exactly the same. It's specialia generalibus derogant, right? Which means the special derogates from the general. However, in CSS, specificity is not as intuitive as it seems at first glance, in the sense that it's actually a number, a set of numbers which we can calculate, and they might not have the specificity that you would intuitively think they have. We're going to see that in a sec. Now, what if I have two rules and they have the same specificity? Well, the latter one is going to apply because it's considered that if you have a later rule, it's going to correct something which happened earlier. Now, what about style? Well, I cannot define, with an exception which we're going to see, but I cannot define something in a rule in a style block or in a linked file that is more specific than something I just write in the style attribute. Now, writing stuff in the style attribute when styling my application is not a great idea. And because it's not a great idea and it makes my code less readable as opposed to classes and all that, why is it here, right? Why does it exist? Well, it exists because it's really useful when I do it dynamically, right? When I populate the style attribute from JavaScript. Because when I do this dynamically, I don't want to wonder what it comes into conflict with. I just want it to apply. But this leads us to a different problem, which we're going to see later, and that's going to need an additional solution. But for now, so whatever is more specific applies over whatever is more generic, whatever comes later applies over whatever comes earlier. Simple rules. Now let's see what this is, right? And what kinds of selectors we have and what specificity is in relation to those selectors. So tooling has evolved in time. So if I look at this particular selector, this means something with the ID D1. I see a little help box there which says selector specificity 100. So this is something I might call a unit selector, right? Something which is a 1 on one of those positions in the selector specificity. So what would be the unit selectors for the other things and how do they work? So let's look at this example, right? So we have a div which is just a div, we have a div with a class, and we have a div with a class and an ID. And in order to style these, I'm going to see what I said, which is I'm going to see them in action. Now, power of habit, these numbers also have a thing in front of them, which is whether the rule is on a style block or not. There are actually 4 numbers, but in the context of what you can write in a file, only the last 3 are written generally. Right, so just ignore the front 0. Right, so this one, we saw that has a specificity of 100. Right, so on this position, on the position where D1 can be found, what I have to do is count how many ID selectors exist. Right, so that's how I calculate the specificity, I just count them. Now, how do I compare 2 of these? Well, I compare them just like numbers, which is I compare them from the most significant position to the least significant position. And if you want a separate way of thinking about it, they're sort of like numbers in an infinite base. right? So you can have a 200, 240, and 3. And you just compare them from the most important digit. Now what about this one? Well, this one means something, or all the things with class alpha. And in this case, this is what's being counted on the second position, right? So the first position was IDs, ID selectors. The second position is class selectors, as well as stuff which counts as class selectors, which we're going to see in the following examples. Right, so it's class selectors and equivalent. And the third position is selectors of element type and equivalent. Again, we're going to clarify this. Right, so these are my unit selectors, IDs, classes, and unit types, and element types. But what's more interesting is to look at it in action for a bit, just so we see how this all gets applied. It's not that one. It's all lines with colors. I'm sorry. We're gonna see something more visually appealing next time. Right. So I have this div, right? And if I look here, I can see, so CSS, right, comes from cascading style sheets. So this is my cascade, and the cascade is read from the bottom to the top. And I have some rules which came from the browser. In this case, they're divs, and divs are basically something which is block displayed. So the idea of a block display is written into the div by the browser itself. Then come my rules. Now, if my rules don't actually come into conflict with anything that was defined before, they just get added. If you look at the documentation for CSS properties, you're going to see that some of them are inherited, some of them are not. If a CSS property is inherited, that means the children are going to have the same property. This is not necessarily true for any property. So for example, something like a border is not inherited, but something like a color is. And it varies from case to case. You can actually see a little table. Let me see, do I have internet? I seem to have internet. So let's say border, CSS border. Now border is another interesting attribute, another interesting property, because it's not actually one property. It's a bunch of properties at the same time. These are composite properties, and they're just shorthand for many properties at the same time. So if I look at this, it's border width, right? And this is actually this. And here we have to have a little table, right? And it says, well, initial value is this, it applies to all elements, it's not inherited, and so forth. So it tells me how the property works. But I can only know these things whether through practice or looking at the documentation, which, again, you're encouraged to do. Right, so here, no conflict. Here, what about here? Well, here, I had this div rule, which said, well, everything which is a div has background color orange. But then I also had something which was everything with class alpha is background color green yellow. And this one is more specific than this one, right? Because this one is 001, which is a lower set of numbers than something which is 010. 010 is larger than 001. Right. What about this one? Well, this one has another conflict, right? But something which has an ID is more specific than something which has a class, is more specific than something which is an element. Notice that specificity governed this stuff, because technically the ID rule came first, right? The other things came later. And still, the ID rule superseded the other ones. Right, so that's the top level of specificity, and how, like I said, the way I'm going to get the numbers is just by counting the things that appear there. Now, if I were to have only these rules, they wouldn't be all that useful, right? Because at least for these unit rules, I have method in JavaScript, right? So there is a getElement by ID, there is a getElements by tag name. The problem with them is that if I were to need some composition, right? If I were to say the buttons which are, I don't know, the delete buttons on the rows, on the odd rows in a table, right? Which is something really easy to write, by the way, but it's really easy to write in shell, right? They're really easy to write with CSS selectors, but What would happen if I didn't have them, and I wanted to select them from JavaScript, for example, is that I would actually have to invent my query language. Not as hard as it seems, but not as easy as it seems. But I would have to invent a query language before I wrote incredibly large amounts of code. Right, so I need to involve multiple rows and multiple nodes, sorry, and I also need to reflect the kind of relationships which exist in a tree, right? Because it's a tree selection mechanism. So first things first, it's a tree, so probably I have to say something about parents, children, all that jazz. So this says all the spans which are direct descendants or children of divs. This means all the spans which can be found in the children collection of divs. Right. What about this one? Well, this one says all the spans which are descendants of divs. Right. So generic descendants, which means they can be found in the subtrees which are attached to divs. That means that it includes children, but also nephews or great nephews or anyway. So it includes all the spans. Like I can read this from right to left, and I'm gonna get what I've just said. Or if I think about it from left to right, I can understand what the mechanism is, right? Which is all the divs are going to be selected, and from those divs, the spans are going to be selected. Now, this is the first gotcha, which is, if I think about this outside of CSS selectors, and I say, well, I have the set of all descendants and the set of children, I would say that the set of children should be more specific than the set of descendants, right? It's a subset. Well, this is not true for CSS, because, like I said, specificity is just a counting exercise. And in this case, the specificity of this one is going to be 0, 0, 2, because I have two element selectors. And the specificity of this one is also going to be 0, 0, 2, which means, which one is going to apply? Well, the latter one. Right. Although it seems more generic. It is not more generic from a CSS standpoint. The second gotcha, don't use cosmetic spaces, because space is more or less an operator. It is an operator of tree descent. That means, if I think about it from left to right, what I have to do after selecting all the divs is I have to go down at least one level, tree descent. Now, the second kind of relationship which exists in a tree is a relationship between siblings, which are children of the same parent, right? And in this case, I have something like image plus span, which means a span which comes directly after an image. Now, directly after means that whatever the index of the span is in the children collection, at an index -1, I have to find an image. Whilst this one is a successor selector, which says, well, a span which comes after an image, but not necessarily directly after. Right. So these are my let's say my selectors which reflect relationship in a tree. And if I look here, I'm going to see first. Let's look at the code. So this span is a descendant, but not a child. This span is a descendant and a child. Now, for this one, I have no conflict, right? What's going to apply is this rule. It's blue-violet. But I'm going to see that both of them are blue-violet because both of those rules were equally specific, and the descendant rule just came afterwards, right? Which is not necessarily as intuitive as specificity might suggest. Right, so that's the first thing. Now, I said that on the first position, I only count IDs. There's no something like IDs, it's just IDs. But on the second position, I said that I count classes and equivalents. Right? Now, what would that be? Well, first of all, one and equivalence is pseudo classes. Now, pseudo classes apply to a variety of situations. But this, what we're going to see now, is the first, well, it's the blueprint for them, so to speak. In the sense that pseudo classes are classes that I didn't add to the document, but the browser behaves as if I did it. Right? So think about it like this. So let's say I want to style the odd rows and the even rows in a table. Right? Why might I want to do that? Well, to create a visual distinction. Right? I want to have each item be clearly separated. And if I were to do it with borders, for example, borders waste some space because they take up space. So I might just alternate colors to create this visual distinction. what I might do is for each of the odd rows, I would put a class called odd. And for each of the even rows, I would put a class called even. But that's going to get really tedious, because after that, I'm going to say, well, yeah, that's great, but the first element has to look different. So I'm going to have a class called odd and a class called first. And the last element, the class called even or odd, and the class called last, and so forth. Right? So it gets really tedious really fast. So the browser behaves as if I've done that. Right? So in this case, this means the list item, which is the first child of its parent. This one is the list item which is the last child of its parent. This is the list item which is the third child of its parent. And for the nth child business, I can also use some expressions. Now I have a shorthand for two expressions, which are odd and even, and handle the case I just mentioned. But I can also write something really complex here. It's just going to be useless. Right? So if I could write n squared plus 3n plus 1. It has no utility whatsoever. But, you know, there is some utility in the sense that I might want to style groups of rows on a gradient, which is something which visually can have some effect. That is, I do the distinction that I said about, but I take it in sets of 4 rows. And the first one is really gray, and the last one is white, and it goes from the first to the last. Anyway, so these are pseudo classes. Notice that so first thing to note, even though some seem more specific than the others, they have the same specificity, which is 0, 1, 1. Because it's a pseudo class and an element, which might trip me up. Second thing to notice, this one, talking about spaces, is different from this one. This would select something completely different. This would select elements which are the first child of their parents, which are descendants of LIs. So it wouldn't include LIs. Right, so don't use spaces without, because they look cute. Right, so in CSS. So that's something to note here. Now, these are not the only pseudo classes. Now, pseudo classes apply to a variety. Notice that pseudo classes, by the way, are marked by this, right? So they have a semicolon, a column. Sorry. So this refers to classes that I didn't add, but I can also have pseudo classes for states of components. So, for example, a link might be visited or it might not be visited. A button might be in the process of being pressed. An input might be valid. A video might be playing. A checkbox might be checked. And there's a bunch of these for all of these situations. And they get there's a richer and richer set every passing year or so. You can find them on MDN. So now let's look at this as well and note that everything looks like the rule for odd and even. Now the reason for this is that, see, the odd rule has the same specificity as the first child rule, and it comes later. Now to make things even stranger, why is the first element odd? Well, for some reason, even though arrays in JavaScript, for example, are 0-based, the list that I'm working with here is 1-based. Right? So the first thing is not going to be at 0, it's going to be at 1. Right, so those are my selectors. What else? Well, let's consider another situation. Let's say we have a bunch of inputs. And I have an input which is a checkbox, an input which is a radio, an input which is a text. How would I differentiate between them? Because, obviously, if I style a checkbox, it's going to be radically different from styling an input text. Right? It doesn't, there's nothing that translates. They work completely differently. But they're the same type, which is going to be input. So what I might be tempted to do is I might be tempted to say, well, input type text class text. But that again is repeating the same information. So instead of needing to do that, I have something which is called attribute selectors. And we can see attribute selectors here. We've used an attribute selector earlier in the DOM manipulation discussion. And let's look at attribute selectors. So first things first, this one is something which has the attribute type. It doesn't matter what value it has, it just has it. This is going to be useful, for example, because if I want to select everything which links to something, so a link, for example, it's going to have an href attribute, but not everything is going to have an href attribute. Now, as for the distinction between inputs, that's not going to suffice, right? They all have a type attribute. But I can use an expression here, so type equals password. Again, these attribute selectors are going to get counted on the same position as the class selectors, right? So the second position that we had in the specificity refers to classes, pseudo-classes, and attributes. Right, so in this case I said, well, if the type of the, if type has the value password, is equal to password, then the background color is different. Now again, something which might trip me up is that these have the same specificity, unintuitively, right? Because it's just an attribute selector, so it's 0, 1, 0. That's it. There's nothing else. Now if we see this, we can see that the text is this and the password is red. That's just because the password rule came later. Right, now as for what I can use in the attribute selector as an expression, now here I have an equals, but I also have some more operators which I can use, which are, they remind us of the characters used for regular expressions. In this case, it's, the first one is class starts with ABC, the second one is class contains ABC, the third one is class ends with XYZ, and the last one doesn't remind us of anything, and it's a special operator which is called word contains. Now, what would the difference be between contains and word contains? Well, word contains means that class is going to contain ABC as a separate word. What does that mean? Well, it means that class is going to be only ABC, or it's going to start with ABC followed by a space, it's going to end with ABC preceded by a space, or have it somewhere in the middle, both preceded and succeeded by a space, right? So why would I need something to select words? Well, the reason, and this is why I use class here as an example, because the reason is that there are attributes in HTML which contain lists of things. Now the lists are separated, the items in the list are separated by spaces. So this is going to allow me to identify if this list contains this particular item. Because, for example, the class attribute here, word contains ABC, but if I were to do this, it no longer word contains ABC, although it still contains ABC. Make sense? Yes, no?
Yes.
Okay.
Makes sense.
Okay.
Like for button primary in Bootstrap.
Possibly.
Median button.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, because you have composition. I realize what you're saying now. Yeah, so in many of these libraries of style things, they tend to isolate different characteristics, so they're composable, right? So in that case, it's whatever a generic button is, but I also say it's positive or primary, and I theoretically I compose them. Yes, Bootstrap. Bootstrap is, however, conceptually a bit of a thing of the past. It was really cool initially because it did a grid layout, but we're going to see, not today, we're going to see next time, that you have a much more flexible grid mechanism in CSS right now. And unfortunately, Bootstrap, in time, still has the fiction of a 12-column grid. Yes or no?
Why?
You're going to see. Because you have display grid. You should just define grids. Why should I have a 12-column
So
grid?
if you use the display grid, it's like really complicated.
It's not complicated. Not really.
F with FR.
With what?
FR.
Yeah, well, FR is a way of, you don't necessarily, so you don't use that, how should I put it? You have much less control in Bootstrap, right? Because you can only think in fractions of 12 of the screen. The advantage that you have is that you have it for multiple types of screens. But think about it like this. How hard is it to make a table with Bootstrap, a table visually, which has a dynamic number of rows? Because you can do it with grid.
Yeah.
And that's why FR is there, right? Because say you have 800 pixels, and you want to represent the following concept. I want to split the 800 pixels equally between how many components there are, but I don't necessarily know how many components there are beforehand. Remind me at the end to show you an example of doing dynamic grids. So yeah, grids are awesome, well, Bootstrap actually exists from before grids existed, you know, and they kept the same way of thinking, and the way of thinking has been superseded. You know, welcome to the future. Right. So we saw that the first position was IDs. The second position was classes and stuff which work like classes, that is attributes and pseudo classes. And the last position, again, I said something like it's elements and stuff which works like elements. Now, if pseudo classes are classes I didn't add, but the browser behaves as if I've added them, pseudo elements, I would expect, are elements I didn't add, but the browser behaves as if I've added them. Well, this is partially true. So for the first example here, it says something, well, first letter of a div, right? So I could do the first letter. I could do something like this. Now, presumably, what I want to do here is, if you've seen the older books which had the beginning of chapters with a larger first letter to mark it, right? So let's say I want to do that. Doesn't really matter. So in this case, I could do this, but it's pretty tedious. I would have to do this. Let's say this happens for every paragraph. I would have to do this for every paragraph. Right, so instead of doing that, the browser considers that I already did it. So it's going to look like this. It's not going to look like this. What number is it? It's 11. It's going to look like this. But this gives us the opportunity to talk about something else. So first things first, this is an element which didn't exist. The browser behaves as if it existed. And what I said here is font size equals 4EM. Now, before getting to the EM bit, let's think about something else, which is I'm going to have a lot of let's say, measurements to specify in CSS. So first, I'm going to have some categories of measurements, right? I might want to measure angles, for example, and for that, I'm going to have what I'm used to, which is degrees and radians. I might want to measure time, and I'm going to have seconds, and I might want to measure lengths and heights and widths and all that. And when I get to lengths and heights and widths, I have this whole variety of ways of measuring them. So first things first, I have some units of measurement which are going to relate to the context in which I am, which is I'm on a computer screen. Now, a computer screen typically is discussed about in terms of pixels. Now, might CSS be used on something other than a computer screen? So, thinking in terms of medium, of display medium, would I use CSS for another display medium, and when? Yeah, but it's still a screen. But what happens if I do this? What's the medium going to be here? It's going to be paper, right? So it's going to be, it's not paper right now, but the target medium is paper. Right, so CSS has a bunch of measurements for typographic stuff, so which is picas, points, edges. Then it has also the measurements, which are maybe useful, from real life, so centimeters and inches and all that jazz. Which I've never used for something useful, but you know. Then I have to consider something else, which is I'm using CSS to draw a tree, which means I have percents, right? So if, for example, the parent of something was 200 pixels wide, I might want to say for a child that it takes up half of the parent's available space, right? So 50%. Then I have I'm drawing a tree, but I'm drawing it within a viewport. Right? The viewport is what's being modified right now, right? So the drawable area. And I have units of measurement which refer to the viewport dimensions. And the viewport has a height of 100 VH, viewport height, and a width of 100 VW, viewport width. Right, so I have those. Well, this still doesn't bring us to what EM is, so why it's useful. Well, EM is something which is relative to the normal size of the text. Why would I need that? Well, let's say I define this in pixels. What would happen if I do this? Well, it will still have 20 pixels or however many it has, but it will not be 4 times as large as the text.
Yes.
Right, so I'm modifying the default size of the text, and because I'm doing this, this is a relative measurement, so it's going to stay 4 times as large, whatever that, whatever the size of the text is. Because obviously the size of the text in pixels changes when I do this. As an aside, there's also a unit of measurement. When I'm saying size of the text, it's about the height of the text. There's also a unit of measurement for the width of the text, which is called the CH. Anyway, so lots of units of measurement. We're going to run into them, depending on what we're doing. So first letter, like I said, was an element which I could have had, but I don't define it, and the browser behaves as if I did. Now, the second example here is more interesting because remember when we looked over white space collapse, right? And I said that whatever is not semantically defined as different is not, the browser is going to worry about it. The browser decides how it's going to be represented, the text is going to be represented. And for example, to note something, see that the number of characters on the first line is not the same, right? The browser decides how many characters can fit, what it's going to do with them, etc. So this, if I were to select the first line to give it some characteristics, I couldn't do it, right, from HTML. There's an arcane way of doing it from JavaScript, but again, it's really tedious, because this should be the responsibility of the browser. So I'm just saying to the browser, well, make this 2 times as large, whatever this is, the first line, right? Whatever characters the first line includes. Right, so this is an element which would have been hard to access. And this one, well, this one is even stranger, because this is an element which would have been impossible to access from a styling perspective. So look, this is a browser, by the way, so Visual Studio Code is a browser instance. It's an Electron app. So look, this is the default selection from the operating system, which is bluish. But if I want to do something different, I can style the selection pseudo element, which, like I said, would have been inaccessible to me. And so pseudo elements cover a variety of cases of stuff I might want to style. And they also cover something even stranger, which we're going to see shortly. Needless to say, however, since they're pseudo elements, they are counted on the element position, which means that the specificity for this one is 0, 0, 2, and for all of these. Okay. Now, the even stranger bit is this one. This is a bad idea which is needed from time to time, which is I can use a pseudo element to modify the content of the page. Now, why is this a bad idea? Because if I said that I use HTML as a structural definition language, and I use CSS as a presentation language. Now, modifying the structure from the presentation doesn't seem like the most maintainable thing to do. Additionally, the thing I'm writing here, I said that all of my elements have an inner HTML property, and if I put some HTML there, the browser is going to handle it. It's going to redraw it, well, parse it, draw it, etc. Well, not for these. These are outside, they're just strings. Now, why would I need this? Well, I presented one case here, it's not the only case, but I'm going to need it for a couple of workarounds that I need to get my interface looking the way I want it. So, for example, if I think about list items, I told you when we talked about them that most elements are a drawable little box. Whilst list items are not just one box, they're 2 boxes, one for the marker and one for the actual text in the list item. And in this case, I want to change the marker. And the way I do it is I ask the list item to not show its marker, and then I just populate the content in the marker. Right. So each of them has this thing. But see, it's not present actually. It's been dynamically inserted, which creates a. So this is all fine as long as it works. which is the how unmaintainable stuff is constructed. Right, so it's a bit of a workaround. It counts as a pseudo element, and that would be it. Now, remember that I said that the style attribute, which was a global attribute, had more precedence. A rule written in the style attribute had more precedence, was more specific than any other rule that I would have written in a CSS file or in a style block or whatever. So this is what's happening here, basically, right? But so I shouldn't write stuff to the style attribute willy-nilly. But what happens if there's no choice? I said that the style attribute is should mainly be regarded as something to populate dynamically. So let's say I take a component library from somebody. The component library contains a, I don't know, combo box. Doesn't matter. And I want to use the combo box, which might be reasonably complex, but I have to integrate it stylistically to my app. It can't look different from the other components in the app. And I start styling it and notice that my styles don't apply. This is because the combo box contains some style attributes which have been populated dynamically from the behavior. Right, so what is there to do then? Well, there's an answer to this, and the reason why I explained it like this is so that you don't use this, to correct your own errors. Right, so this is important. This is a directive, and it's there to handle precisely the situation I told you about. Right, so I take a component from somebody else. I don't have the sources. Well, I do have the sources in the sense that they're in the browser. I'm going to know what the style rules are. But I want to use the component. I don't want to fork the repository. Right, I don't want to take over maintaining the repository. Right, so how would I override the style rules that they've used when building their component? Well, the answer is I'm going to write my rules with important. If it's all my code, I should never use important. Okay, I should look for the way to actually do it. Because, on the one hand, what important does is it starts a new cascade. Right? So it's if I have a conflict between rules with important, it's going to be governed by specificity, exactly like a conflict between rules. Right? But the rules, all the rules with important, are a separate thing, which all has precedence larger than anything that's not important. Right? But think about it like this. This is an emergency button, and when I press it, it's pressed. That's it. I can't unpress it. So if the third-party library dude made some rules with important, we have no more solutions, right? So that's it. It's pressed. I then have to make some arcane selectors which are going to be more specific than their selectors, etc. So the reason why it's there is so that the library builder can use the style attribute, which may be very useful, right? Because it might contain calculated values. Because it's calculated values, I'm not going to be. So if I want to modify something dynamically at runtime, I might add and remove classes, or I might change values in style. But if it's calculated values, positions on the screen, etc., what am I going to do? I'm going to make 1,000 classes? No. I'm just going to write into style, which creates this problem, which has this solution. Right. So yeah. So that's important. Important is important. Now, apart from the selectors we've seen, let's look at a couple of stranger things, which is these are not pseudo classes, rather they're operators. These are not the only operators, there's a bunch of them. There's also where and is and so forth, but for where and is, those are more syntactic sugar, right? You can just write cleaner things. So we're interested in a couple of things. So this says anything that has the class alpha, but not the class beta, right? And what's relevant is that not is not going to be counted in any way. So this has the same specificity as .alpha, .beta. So it has 0 to 0. So this is one operator, and what it's going to do is it's going to color only this one. So let's we forgot to look over the last one and this one. So let's go a bit here. And what I want to emphasize here is that if I have two important rules, they're governed by specificity. So the reason why this one wins is that it's more specific than this one. As for the not, we're just going to, no, it's not this one. We're just going to see it in action, which is only this particular div was colored because it has alpha but not beta. So like I said, there's a bunch of operators. There's only one I want to talk about specifically, which is refers to a particular thing. So the standards for CSS are dynamic. So there's different standards for different bits, which have different committees, which have different versions and different levels of adoptions. It's quite horrible. Right, so one of the things which has been asked of the CSS selector committee historically was to create selectors which allow you to select the parent of something. Now, selecting the parent of something is not really a smart move if what you're doing is styling your components. You shouldn't need it. However, it's really useful if what you're doing is in JavaScript and you're using CSS selectors with query selector all to select something relevant. Because, to describe the situation, what you're usually going to have is you're going to have a list of things. It's a list of items. And the items have some buttons on them. And you say, when I press the delete button, I want to delete this particular item. But the ID of the item is not on the button. It's on the container. It's just one ID. So your solution is going to be, again, really complicated. You have to navigate the tree. Or, what you might want is a selector to say, well, select the row which contains the button that I pressed, basically. Right, so we have something like that now, and it's
Node in JavaScript.
Huh?
Parent node in
Yes, but you have to navigate through the parents, and the structure might be complicated, right? So for reasons, for any situation you might imagine, it might get more and more complicated. So what if the line, well, it contains the button, but maybe it has an area for the button and images and so forth. So maybe it's not parent, it's parent of parent of parent of parent of parent of parent. It creates some really horrible code, right? Because think about it. So either what you're going to do is I'm going to write a function which, given a node, is going to recursively search the parents until it gets something with a particular attribute. Solution number one. Or you're going to remember that it's a depth of 6 parents. It doesn't. It creates an issue. It has solutions, so it's not like it doesn't have solutions. But the idea is that it's a lot more work than it should be. So instead, what I'm going to use is this. So this is all divs which have divs as children. So it's reversing the right. So instead of divs which are children of divs, I want to have all divs which have divs as children. So I want to say all the elements which contain something which looks like this.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's an anchor selector, right? So this one, for example, what does this say? Well, instead of saying all the p's that come after divs, it says all the divs which have p's coming after them, right? So it reverses the direction of selection, which is really useful for the parent-child. So of course, these are not to be used unless they're necessary. Again, so my objective is to make my code more readable, not less readable. Although you know the joke, right? There was this the joke about why C++ appeared. Well, the language is so complex that you can never fire the programmers. So you can write horrible code because you're the only one who's going to be able to maintain it. Let's not get into those situations, though. Right, so that concludes our discussion about CSS selectors. Like I said, we've not covered all of them, but we've covered all the principles. So if you have any questions up until this point. No?
Are we going to make all these selectors at some point on a part?
It's going to depend. So they're not that hard, really. So they're pre-selection expressions. They fit on a page. They're not that hard. You should be able to use them sort of reflexively, and if you can't, you're being helped. So for example, if I look at anything, I can see the selector path. See it?
Okay.
But of course, if I can actually copy the CSS selector from somewhere here. Right, copy selector. But I shouldn't use stuff which is like this because it has too many things in it.
And can I use GTRL and select all of them and browser, the DOM will know what is the selector actually? I mean,
maybe
ask for
Control L.
adding.
I think Control L was clear, so and I don't know what you're referring.
I mean,
Right. So
Deci
so
și să aleg mai multe clase și el să știe că trebuie să fie has, nu știu ce. Asta ar putea fi.
no, it's you're asking too much of this. You should file a CV with Google and help us all. No, and it's not that advanced. It's as advanced as it can be at this moment. That's how it's presented.
Okay.
Right. But it's still it's pretty cool. You can do all this stuff, so you know. But like I said, it's not that complicated to get to the point where you can use this stuff reflexively. It's not. It's quite intuitive in the end. It's syntactically horrible, but it's quite intuitive. You know, it's not necessarily syntactically endearing, but it's just navigating a tree, etc. It just needs some exercise. And you're not going to get away from CSS, so you should do it. There's no alternative to CSS. Literally. There's literally no used alternative. And that's why, I mean, if you look at this one, right, this is made in CSS as well. So the actual editor is styled in CSS. So. Yeah. So, let's get, of course. Yeah, I'll get back to that. So, where was it? What's this one? So, I'm measuring something, right? The something has 3 positions. The positions you can regard as digits, right? Just like you would say 300 is larger than 29, because 29 doesn't have anything on that position, that significant position. This is the same way you're going to do it with specificity. So you want to compare some numbers. Now the question is going to become, how do I associate numbers to those rules? Right? Because if I look here, I can see I have a rule. This is the rule. And it's going to have the specificity, the number, the precedence, of whatever the query expression was. Okay? Right. So notice that, don't worry about what's inside, but it's 3 positions, 3 things, 3 digits. Obviously, if I compare 2 numbers and they have something other than 0 on the first position, it's going to be the larger first position, then the larger second position, and so forth. Now, from left to right, the first position means IDs. So I'm just going to, when looking at an expression like this, I'm just going to count how many IDs appear. So how many ID selectors appear, stuff with a sharp in front of them. This is something with the ID D1. Right. The second position is going to be classes. 1 second. Is going to be classes. So this means everything with class alpha. Right? So if I count here, let's clarify this. I'm going to give up the AED a bit, so let's just write it like this. Right? So it's going to be 0, 1, 0, because there's no IDs, there's a class, and then there's nothing else, no elements. And the last position is going to mean how many elements there are. So how many tag names, basically. Now this is a bit more complicated, because on the class position I have pseudo classes and attribute selectors, I also count those. And on the element position I also have pseudo elements, and I also count those. Does it make sense? Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? No. So it's an exercise in counting, more or less. And this helps me. So right now if I write a selector, I can see it pre-calculated. But I have to understand why something isn't working, basically. Because this is, like one of the founders of computer science said, when we were starting writing code, we understood that we're going to spend half our time correcting our own mistakes. Right? So that's the gist of it. You have to understand why stuff is not working, which is why I insisted on the whole specificity is a number, is not necessarily what you intuitively would assume it would be. You know, right? It's, yeah. Okay? So, we're going to continue a bit with the drawing stuff. Now, when talking about CSS, unfortunately, next time we're going to get to the grid and flex and modern CSS. So right now we're going to start from less modern CSS. Now, less modern CSS doesn't mean it's not involved. It's quite heavily involved, so it's not something that has been superseded by something. It's something to which pieces have been added. So to draw something, to draw something on the screen, first of all, what would I have to know about it? Right? So what are the elements of drawing something on the screen? And I gave you that little metaphor that it's like drawing a tree starting from the leaves. Remember? So if I think about the whole tree of the page, and I think about how I draw a leaf, it's going to be a little rectangle with pixels in the end. And then I can aggregate this, right? If I have all the children of a node, and I know additional stuff about the children, I can draw the parent based on the children. And if I aggregate this until the root, in the root I'm going to find this whole thing which is drawn in the browser, what I see in the viewport. So the first thing which we might want to note is this one. So whenever I select any element, I'm going to see this little drawing here. This is something which is called the CSS box model, and everything which is drawable has these characteristics. So, in the sense that all these things, which are numbered, which are named, sorry, so in the center is going to be the content. Think about the painting, right? The content is going to be the area which is painted. Then, they have some space between the content and the frame of the painting. That is called the padding. Then I have the frame, which is called the border. And then, if I want to have that the whole wall with a bunch of paintings, I want to specify what distance I want between them. And that's going to be the margin. So this raises some questions. So first of all of these are reflected in properties, and all the properties are directional. We already saw border, but the directional property is a shorthand for multiple properties, right? So when I say padding 5 pixels, that's actually going to mean padding in all directions 5 pixels. So if I say padding 5 pixels, 10 pixels, that's going to mean top and bottom is going to be 5, and the laterals left and right is going to be 10. If I give it 4 values, it's going to be all directions and so forth. Right, so they're shorthands. But another question comes to mind. What does it mean when I say something has a height of 100 pixels? What does it refer to? Yes, so by default it refers to the content. But this is something controllable. This is called box sizing. So there's a property called box sizing, which refers to what heights and widths, what dimensions mean, right? So do they mean the content or do they mean something else? So what else is, apart from content box could I have? I could have a padding box, which exists but is not supported in all the browsers. And then I could have a border box. So if I had a border box, that would mean that when I say 100 pixels tall, that's going to mean the content, the padding, and the border. Now the margin can never be included. There's no way to include it in dimensions. Now, this also raises another question, which is, well, when I say the height of something, do all things have height? Can I control the height of anything?
I think for
No, the answer is no. But what would I not be able to control the height? So the idea of something which I can control the width and height of is called dimensionability, right? It's dimensionable. Are all things dimensionable? Can you think about something which might not be dimensional? So divs, we've seen divs. Divs are definitely dimensional, right?
Yeah.
Right. So, but for example, links are not dimensionable by default. So dimensionability is based on that property which we've already seen, which is called display, right? So something which is display block is something displayed as a block which is sizable, dimensionable. Whilst something like a link is going to be something which is called display inline, which is not sizable. Now, when I say this is not something, this does not mean in CSS that you can't put properties for height and width on the style of that. You can, they're just not going to have any effect. But CSS is not going to give you any error, it's just not going to apply them, and you're going to get a little warning sign if you look in the debugger. Right? And if you wonder, why does this not become taller? Probably because it's non-dimensional. We're going to see this in some layout examples. However, First, let's see something simpler. One sec. Right. Right. So this is this is about what I was talking. Let's say so we have the container which is 400 wide, that's 400 tall. That's what we care about. And then we have these which are 200 tall. And let's say I don't set box sizing. Now this is something we've not seen for CSS selectors, but it's just a way of writing multiple selectors on a single line. So they're different selectors separated by a comma. That's because if I were to select part 1, it would have these properties, and if I were to select part 2, it would have the same properties. And instead of writing them 2 times, I can just use a comma. Right, so this isn't quite what I expected, right? Just like I said. Because, while this has 400, and these have 200, the 200 refers to the content, which means they have 200 plus all the borders, which is the border, I forgot what it was, so plus 12. But if I do this, then the border is going to be drawn inside the dimensions, so it's going to fit. Okay? Right.
Or if I apply width and height big content.
Yeah, but that's not, you're not working in absolutes. I could say 50%. But no. So, by the way, if I were to say 50%, it would have the same effect. So a height of 50% with a height of 50% would not fit. So the border is going to be outside.
Yes, because of the...
Because it's... So what you're saying is I'm not going to give it a precise height. So if I want to give it a precise height, you see what I'm saying? So you're solving a problem. You can do object fit content, but that's you're solving the problem by having, so you're talking about an object, right, which has to fit in a container. That's fine. The object has some innate dimensions, right? It's an image or a video or something, and you're scaling the object to fit the. But you're not. Here we're talking about something a bit different, which is I've given the dimensions manually. That's not what you're doing there. What you're doing is asking the browser to calculate the dimensions automatically. And the browser will do it, but what I'm saying, it's a different problem. It's a solution to a problem, but it's not this problem. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Because, so to speak, think about it, think exactly, try to fix it with object fit content. Try to fix exactly this problem, which is, I have 2 images, right? And I want each of them to take 50% of a div. It's doable. Try it out. But it's not doable with fit content. See what I'm saying? I mean, it's so the way you can do it with object fit content is by basically containing them in some divs.
This is what I wanted to...
Yeah, but you're changing the structure.
Yeah.
So it's not, what I'm saying is, like I said, this solves a problem. It's a different problem. And it's an existing problem.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, let's look at something else. And this is the last thing we're going to have time to go through, which is, so we're still going through, let's say, properties that the thing might have, which we need to draw the thing. So another thing, another such property is the idea of positioning. So, how are things positioned in the web page? Well, the browser is going to handle it, right? So if I don't say anything, the browser is going to calculate where things are positioned in the web page. So this is called static positioning. So this is the default positioning scheme, and it's called static positioning. Now, it's the value of a property which is called position, but the property has more than static positioning. So let's see. 1 second. Let me just clarify what's happening here. So let's see. So we have a container. The container is 400 by 400, and let's say none of these is positioned in any sort of way. Looks like this, right? So the divs, now divs are going to take up all the space they have available to them on the horizontal. The parent has 400 pixels, so that's what they are. And on the vertical, they're going to be as tall as they need to contain their content. And so that's the default div behavior. Right. I did something else. This is another selector we've not talked about. This is a selector with specificity 0. And what I did is, just for debug purposes, I said that everything in the page, which this selector refers to, has a border and it's box sizing border, both, so it doesn't mess with our. So there's no, just so we see it clearer. So now what happens if position is relative? Now notice that everything had left, a property called left, in this case. So the way that position works is that I'm going to be able to specify where an element is going to end up via 4 properties, which are left, right, top, and bottom. Now the significance of these properties is different depending on the positioning scheme, right? So the positioning scheme being the thing I'm modifying by putting something other than static in position. In this case, the positioning scheme is relative. So what does the relative mean? It means I'm going to let the browser calculate where it should place me on the screen, and then I'm going to offset from that position. Right? So in this case, I'm going to push, like I would push with the hand to the left. I'm going to create a little buffer to the left, which means that this thing just gained a space of 100 pixels to the left. Right. So what if these were positioned as well? What would they be positioned in relation to? Well, whenever I position something relatively, whenever I position something, a new drawing flow is created. That is, that particular subtree is going to be drawn separately. The browser is going to get the rectangle, and then the rectangle is going to be replaced in the DOM. So we're in a separate drawing flow here. Right? This is this particular square doesn't know how the rest of the page functions. So if I reposition this one, it's going to be relative to its current position, which is right? I'm creating a drawing flow from a drawing flow. Anyway, and these do sort of the same thing in the sense that part 2 is going to return to its initial spot, and these are going to exchange places. But it's the same thing, right? These one have top and bottom, and this one has a right. Right, so what other positioning schemes do I have? Sorry, I'm going to get through this a bit faster, and we're going to maybe recomment this if it's needed next time. So in this case, I also have some text, and I have position absolute. Now, what is position absolute? Now, position absolute is a positioning scheme for which instead of offsets, left top or right bottom are coordinates. But they're coordinates in a bit of a different fashion than coordinates you've regularly encountered. So generally, when I'm drawing something on the screen, I don't have an origin and an infinite plane. What I have is a rectangle, right? So if I think about drawing something inside the rectangle, coordinates are going to be something which is in relation to one of the corners of the rectangle, and it can be any corner. Right? So I can set coordinates based on any corner. I know it's a rectangle. So left top is going to be top left corner, right top, and I can do it relative to any of them. Right, so position absolute. What is this? 17. Position absolute is a positioning scheme which relates to the rectangle of the first positioned ascendant, so parent or grandparent or whatever. So I'm going to look at my parent and see, is my grandparent positioned? So does it have another value than static in the position property? Yes or no? If yes, I'm going to reposition myself depending on my parent. If not, I'm going to go to the grandparent and so forth. So what if I don't find any? Well, the answer is that the document itself is always positioned. Right? So again, position means something which is not position static. Right, so in this case, my parent was positioned, container. It had position relative. So everything fits here. But if I make the parent unpositioned, right, it's position static, they're going to go to the corners. But the corners are going to be the corners of the initial document. Right? So I can do this. Right, so this raises the need if I want to do overlays. So overlays are things which are not relative to anything in the document, they're relative to the viewport. I can change the positioning scheme to the last one, which is going to be position fixed. And position fixed, the only difference for this is that in the CSS, instead of position absolute, is position fixed. And these are completely taken out of the document. And initially I might think it's the same thing, but it is not. Right? So what I did is an overlay. These remain on the screen. These are really useful if you want that little chat icon which always stays on screen, or if you want that little menu under which the page scrolls, right? Or if I want that little pop-up which autoplays a video which is annoying, so I can, it's various use cases. But it's really good for overlays, because I might want stuff like that. I might want a help button for a complex application which always stays in the same position. I might, so that's position fixed. With this, I'm going to end this because we have no more time. I'm going to answer any additional questions.